Good morning, students. So today I will discuss on the poem London by Samuel Johnson. As you know that this particular poem London by Samuel Johnson is considered to be one of his most important writings in English, as so far as Johnson's fame is concerned, and so far as the satiric poems written by Samuel Johnson is concerned, we find that two of his poems, the first one is London, that is this one, and the second one is The Vanity of Human Wishes. These are considered to be mostly important for Samuel Johnson's career. Uh, as we know that this particular poem is considered, that is London, is considered to be the most important one so far as your CC8 syllabus is concerned, because it is in your detailed section. So before going to this particular text, let us begin with the fundamental focus on the concept of neoclassicism. It is an introductory lecture that I will consider here, and somehow after this elaborated form of introduction that I will make, certainly we will go to the particular text, that is the text of London. But before going to that, we need to make a kind of introductory study of London, you see. So fundamentally, as we have mentioned here, as you can see here, that it is called the neoclassicism that comes into action. Now, the question certainly arises, what do we mean by neoclassicism, and why Samuel Johnson has to be treated as a neoclassicist? Fundamentally, as we can see here in this particular diagram or in this particular chart, that neoclassical period is being divided into four major sections. In the books, generally, it has been pointed out that neoclassical period begins with the age of Dryden. This particular thing, you see, that begins with 1660. But somehow I want to introduce that particular part also in the neoclassical period, because we will get that age of Milton or the Commonwealth period has to be treated as within the neoclassical one, obviously. So what you can see here, beforehand, we need to know something about neoclassicism, and then the neoclassical period and the features of neoclassicism in detail. These are actually needed so far as this particular discussion is concerned, so far as the interpretation of the poem London by Samuel Johnson is concerned. So the term neoclassical, as you can see, that here you can differentiate the term neoclassical or divide the term neoclassical into two major sections. The first one is new, okay, from where the term neo probably comes, because there are some kind of differences between the earliest form of classical representations and the newer form. And then you can get the term classical. That means it actually has its association with the classical past, or maybe it have to be related with say the Greco-Roman period or Greco-Roman literature, and at the same time you can relate it with the typical Latin literature of the period. So what I'm trying to suggest here, that so far as the neoclassical period is concerned, as we can see in this particular slide, you will find that the four major subdivisions can be made regarding the historicity, regarding the historical divisions. And so the first one is age of Milton or the Commonwealth period. As we know, it is the particular period where you can find that Oliver Cromwell is ruling almost, okay, he is one among the Republicans and he is leading them. That is after Charles I's death. You see, we find that the Republicans are coming to the forefront and they are beginning this particular area. So probably you have gone with this particular form when you have the text of Paradise Lost, when you get the basic impetus of this particular period, this Commonwealth period. The second one, it is the age of Dryden, or it is considered as Restoration period in the history of English literature. You will find that Restoration period is considered to be the period where everything got restored. It is the restoration of monarchy. Because after the republicanism, or after the Commonwealth period, you will get that Charles II was brought back from France. And with him, we can find the restoration of monarchy is taken place. And it is not simply the restoration of monarchy, but at the same time, you will find that with this particular form of restoration of monarchy, there was the restoration of other things, you see. That is open, open performances of plays, or maybe the reopening of the theaters, and so and so. So this is the Restoration period. Next, you will find it is the age of Pope, or that is called the Augustan period, and is, as we know, it is the 18th century because it begins with the year 1700 and runs up to 1744 almost. And you will find that during this Augustan period, England moves, so far as you see, that so far as the literary perspectives are concerned, so far as the technical perspectives are concerned, we find that in this particular period, that is Augustan period, England moved to such an extent that it has been considered as Augustan, you see. It is called the age of prose and reason. That means the rationalistic faculties, or maybe the philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, they actually came to the forefront. And ultimately, we can find that during this time period, in England, there is a huge form of advancement regarding the publications of new texts and ideologies and moralities and so. So that's why it is Augustan, because during the reign of Augustus Caesar, we can find there are eminent authors like, you see, Virgil and Horace, they came. So ultimately, this is a particular reason why this particular period is also considered as Augustan period. And so everywhere you can find that the classical temperament, classical antiquity, classical decorum, all these things have been taken into consideration during this particular period. It is very important so far as history of English literature and history of neoclassicism or neoclassical period is concerned. The next particular part that I have to say here, it is the age of Johnson, or it is called the age of sensibility. Probably you have noted that I have named the period along with, or the period in accordance with the main writer of this period. That's why there is Milton, there is Dryden, there is Pope, and there is Johnson. So ultimately, you can find it is the age of Johnson, or the age of sensibility, you see. So ultimately, in Johnsonian canon of taste, in Johnsonian canon of writing, we can find that the sensibilities have to some extent are present to the highest extent. So that's why in this particular time period, you will find it is the 1744 to 1785, and during this time period, England moved to such an extent, and probably you will get that during this time period, there are mammoth kind of impetus being given to the literary cycle, obviously. So this is the typical neoclassical period in a nutshell, that typical form of outline. So let us begin with the particular section with the features of neoclassicism. That means, what do we mean by the term neoclassical, and what are the salient features of neoclassicism? Because we have to concentrate on the particular poem London. As I mentioned earlier, it is London by Samuel Johnson, and it is the introductory discussion. So ultimately, you will find that how so far, or what are the salient features of neoclassicism that can be traced in Samuel Johnson's London. It is very important because we have to treat Samuel Johnson's London as an example of, satire or satiric writing in general. So therefore, you need to carry the basic impetus, you need to carry the basic resurgences of the particular forms of neoclassicism and how these are being associated or articulated in terms of London and so. So that's why the first feature, I'm quoting M.H. Abrams, you see, that regarding the neoclassicism, the features and the other things in the next slides that have been presented here, you will find that I am actually moving with M.H. Abrams. It is a terms book, it is M.H. Abrams' a glossary of literary terms, where you can find these features have been dealt in detail, and probably it is in your syllabus, it is in your suggested books to read. So fundamentally, I have taken resources from M.H. Abrams' glossary of literary terms so that you can find the texts at hand, and ultimately it will help you in reading them, in knowing them in an easy way. So fundamentally, what I'm trying to suggest here, you see, that regarding the features of neoclassicism, M.H. Abrams notes, it exhibited a strong traditionalism. The first term that it indicates is the form of traditionalism. Why I'm trying to identify this, that you will find, I will come to that later in this particular lecture, that when you will go with the poem London by Samuel Johnson, you will find that at the title page of this particular work, Samuel Johnson had noted that this particular work, that is London, was structured on the basis of the third satire of Juvenal. That means it is the classical writer, obviously. So that's why you need to know why Johnson is incorporating the classical work like Juvenal's satires, and why he is imitating them. Because it is a time period, you see, that when it was being considered, some psychological perspectives are working, you see, it has been treated by the philosophers like Locke, and it has considered that mind is the blank sheet of paper. It's a tabula rasa, to be specific. And you see that every incidents and experiences have left deep imprintations on them. So whenever you are writing something, according to them, you see, according to these philosophers, whenever you are trying to write something, your fundamental focus is to find the experiences that have been imprinted on in your blank sheet of paper, on your mind, actually. And it is not that you are creating something, rather you are trying to imitating something. So it is an imitation that is actually working. So it is a typical tendency, it is the typical trend of the neoclassical period to imitate. Now the question certainly arises that mind is passive, it cannot create anything, so that we have to imitate. But imitate whom? Okay, who will be the authors, or which are the texts that we should imitate? Then they considered that ultimately there are ready at hand the classical texts, and they have proved the excellence by the form of their sustenance. Say, for example, in the year 2000, you are reading the ancient texts written by Homer. So is it not possible for you to identify, to think that these are the wonderful specimens of literature? These are the excellent form of literature. And in the form of sustenance, they have proved their excellence. So whenever you will try to write something, you are trying to write a typical genre, a typical form of poetry, a typical form of satire, a typical form of prose writing, then ultimately you had some examples from the ancient texts. And it is your work, it is your duty to imitate them, blindly imitate them to some extent. I should say here that so far as the comparisons between the neoclassicists and the classicists are concerned, you will find that the neoclassicists are much cruder to some extent. Why? Because they are blindly following the classical texts, you see. So that's why it is a kind of a strong traditionalism that the neoclassicists aimed at. It is traditional, that's why they are imitating them, which was often joined to a distrust of radical innovation. So the distrust is obviously at the core of the neoclassical period, that you cannot trust any innovation, you cannot trust anything radical, and was evinced in their great respect for classical writers, that is, the writers of ancient Greece and Rome, who were thought to have achieved excellence and established the enduring models in all the major literary genres. So that is the fundamental thing that I am trying to suggest here. Image Abrams marks this. So it is the formation of the traditionalism, and they are following the Greco-Roman structure of literature, Greco-Roman patterns of writing, and they are using them. Now, they consider that literature, okay, so literature was conceived to be primarily an art. That is, a set of skills, you see, which, though it requires innate talents, must be perfected by long study and practice. That means literature itself has to be considered as an art, and it can be perfected by long study and practice, because it is nothing but a skill. So following them, obviously, we are not accepting all the principles and all the thoughts that have been propagated by these neoclassicists. But at the same time, we consider that the neoclassicists thought that it's kind of a set of skills that might be perfected by long study and practice. That means if you practice, if you read properly, you see, then you can be a person like William Shakespeare, probably. You know that it can't be possible in reality. Though they are putting some pros and cons. They are putting some star marks, you see, that it requires innate talents. And if you don't have the talent, then you cannot. But ultimately, if you have the talent, then the study and practice, it will make you a better author, a better writer like William Shakespeare. Another thing that I should say here, a new form of classicism is neoclassicism that gave much importance to classical writing, as I have stated here. Its features, decorum, that's the very term that is being introduced by Horace in his Ars Poetica, balance, order, craftsman's ideal, finish, correction, etc. So these are the fundamental focus of the neoclassicists, and they always considered that art, you see, in the next section you will find that in his Ars Poetica, probably you have heard the name. The Ars Poetica is a famous work. It is the philosophical and at the same time theoretical work by Horace. And you will find that in Horace's Ars Poetica, he writes that art has twofold function: to instruct and to delight. So you see, the two terms have been introduced here. The first one is instruction. The second one is delight. So actually, these are the two terms that Horace is trying to propagate. What does it mean? You see, delight, it indicates a kind of pleasure that will be given to you. What kind of pleasure? It might be concentrated. It might be considered as a pleasure that can be considered as, say, called aesthetic pleasure. Okay, and that's why in Aristotle's Poetics, he has mentioned the consideration of catharsis, where you have found that somehow, though tragedy is an indication of a kind of misfortune, the death of any person, but it pleases us. Why? Because we get a kind of aesthetic pleasure from the text. So that particular form of delight is actually indicating towards a kind of a pleasure that has to be taken as important in the neoclassical formation of art too. And at the same time, you will find that Horace is referring to the particular term instruct. You see, what is the form of instruction? You will find that according to the classical antiquity, according to the classical decorum or the pattern of writing, you will find certainly the classicists thought that if art doesn't have anything moralizing, anything related to the correctal purpose or correction purpose, you see, and if it is not possible that the people of a particular society cannot get anything positive, if the society cannot get anything for any further improvement, then it is no longer to be needed to read anything or maybe experience any form of art any longer, because there is a certain kind of improvement there. So where there is no form of improvement for the society or maybe the persons of the society, that particular text cannot be considered to be a good text anymore. So that's why you will find that so far as classical literature is concerned, classical formation of art is concerned, they are always focusing at the particular form that you need to instruct something. You need to give lessons to the persons who are actually watching or reading your text, or you need to instruct them to behave properly. So that's why in the classical literature, we find that whenever the authors are trying to write something, show something, there is a moralizing tone, certainly. And they, with the particular form of literary perspectives, they are trying to make something better. The betterment is needed. The improvement is needed so far as the societal perspectives are concerned. Now, when you will get the neoclassical texts like London, you will find that it's a satire, as I mentioned just now. It's a satire, and it's a satire made against the political and societal perspectives of London during that time. And he is, that is, Samuel Johnson is imitating Juvenal, who is also writing his third satire, criticizing, the Roman perspectives, you see. So ultimately, what I'm trying to suggest that why Samuel Johnson is writing a particular form of satire through this particular poem, that is London. So you need to identify, you need to focus on the basis of this particular form of literature. That is instruction, that is morality, that is the typical form of correction that you have to make. Why? Because you are thinking about a better future. You are thinking about a better London. You are thinking about a society that can provide you some extra importance to you. And also the moralistic perspectives have to be focused here. So following Horace's Ars Poetica and Horace's conceptions regarding art as twofold function, that is to instruct and delight, we find here that apart from giving pleasures to the perceiver of art, that is, read here poetry, Another major function is to give instruction or preach morality, so that the foils and foibles, you see, these are the negative terms, obviously, of the society. These are the to some extent the behaviors of the people of the society that has been completely degenerated and degraded may be corrected in due course. So that is the fundamental focus that I am trying to suggest here. That is why the neoclassical authors get much importance to the purpose of correction, truly. Just like the satiric writings of the ancient classical age or classic age, neoclassical literature focused more on satiric writings with a view to correcting the society and moralizing people in its truest sense. So that is the fundamental question, that is the fundamental focus, what the neoclassicists are actually aiming at regarding the better performances and betterment of the society and betterment of the people in general. That is the moralizing people, you see. Now let us move towards the concept of the satire, you see. As we have found that London, it is being imitated after the satire by Juvenal. It is the third satire by Juvenal. So therefore, we have to concentrate on the term satire and who are the satirists, the major formations of satire, and how so far this particular text can be considered as a typical Juvenalian satire. You see, so that is the fundamental thing that I should discuss here, because probably you will get the questions of 5 marks where you will be asked that how so far London can be considered as a typical Juvenalian satire. Discuss. So fundamentally, you should know what is satire, who are the satirists to some extent, okay, in the ancient part, and how many types of satire we encounter in English literature or maybe in Latin literature in general. So you will find, again, I am referring to Abrams. Abrams quotes, or Abrams gives the definition of satire as a satire is, you see, the literary art of diminishing or derogating a subject. So diminishing a subject, derogating a subject by making what? By making it ridiculous and evoking toward it attitudes of amusement, contempt, scorn, or indignation. So this is the definition that Abrams provides. What she says, Abrams says that it is an art, or it is an art of diminishing or derogating a subject. So ultimately, you will find that whenever a particular satirist is aiming at, you see, that he is trying to diminish the status of that particular subject. It is a kind of derogating a particular one, you see, by making it ridiculous. You see, ridiculous means to which or to whom you can laugh at. So you will find that he is making it ridiculous and evoking toward its attitudes of what? Amusement, number one, that is that actually in, the ingredient of laughter is being associated with them. You see, contempt, a kind of scorn that have been related to them, and contempt is there, or maybe indignation. So ultimately, you will find that with the particular form of satire, that in Bengali it is called Bengattok Lekha, in satire, ultimately, you will find that somehow the author is trying to propagate a particular kind of alternative portrayal. That means, say for example, if we can find that a typical religion or maybe the religious practice in a particular society, it is actually going to astray, you see, or going to the dogs, then ultimately you are projecting the clergymen, okay, projecting the persons from the churches, and you are showing them in an odd way, you see, by diminishing their status, by derogating their attitudes, and you are creating some kind of amusement, because whenever that particular person is being seen on stage by, say, the spectators of that particular society, they can find something amusing. It seems to be ludicrous to them, and they could identify what is the problem within this. And that's why with a particular form of scorn, with a particular form of contempt and indignation, you see that the satirist is trying to propagate that particular problem within the society, and somehow they are trying to propagate their own ideologies that the betterment is needed. So the people who are actually watching the performance, or maybe the reader who is reading the text, he could feel or she could feel that ultimately it is not good, and that is we must think about the better thing, and we must do, or we must act properly in our society. So in this way, you see, a correction method or a correctal method has been given, a morality has been preached. You will find that somehow here also the weapon, the actual weapon is laughter. True. Similarly, you will find in a comedy, laughter is always being used as a weapon, obviously. But there is a basic difference between a satire and a comedy. Okay. In our next point, I have discussed about them. So Abrams writes that satire differs from the comic in that comedy evokes laughter mainly as an end in itself. That means where the laughter is there and ultimately there is an end in itself. Okay. While satire derives, that means satire here, laughter is the beginning, obviously, because it is indicating something else. So while satire derives, that is, it uses laughter as a weapon and against a but that exists outside the work itself. That but may be, okay, that means the person or maybe something that have been aimed at here, the weapon is being thrust against him. So that but may be an individual or a type of person or a class, an institution, a nation, or even the entire human race. So anything, you see. So ultimately, you will find that whenever you will go through the satiric writings, whether it is a poetry or maybe a prose or maybe a satiric representations that have been made in a fiction, ultimately you will find that somehow the satires have been addressed or satires have been made of a class, a person, an institution, a nation, or maybe the human race in general. So ultimately, you will find that the objective or the focus of any particular satire is not simply restricted to any person. Rather, it can be something greater. It can be a class, it can be an institution, it can be a nation, or even the entire human race that have been taken in consideration. Think about Gulliver's Travels, you see, that is in your syllabus also. You will find that Gulliver's Travels is a prose satire again. And fundamentally, you will find that how the satiric representations have been made. Now, whenever you are going through the land of the Lilliputians, you will find that the Lilliputians or the patterns of Lilliputians you see, their politics, their temperament, their mentality, their actions, these are actually resembling the then London. And you can find that through some characters like Flimnap and others, you will trace that they are actually indicating towards some particular political personnel at the time of Jonathan Swift. Again, so the references of big Indians and small Indians, okay, and the Lilliputians and Blefuscudians. So ultimately, you will find the high hills and low hills and etc. etc. In everywhere, you will find some Whigs and Tories have been taken in considerations. Some say Roman Catholicism and Protestantism has been allegorically represented here. So ultimately, you will find that when Jonathan Swift is writing his text, he is not simply focusing on some individual characters like some political persons. Rather, it is representing a particular class, a society, the class orientations, religion, religious hypocrisy, and obviously it becomes a social satire in general. And towards the end of the text, probably it is not in your syllabus, in book 4, that is the land of the Hunyans. There you will get that after returning from the land of the Hunyans, Gulliver cannot just bear the smell of the human beings any longer. So in that particular form, to him, it is better to live in the stables of the horses. Why? Because he finds that the human beings are some diminutive figures. Okay, they are without wisdom. And that is actually indicating towards the pattern of misanthropic or misanthropism, where Swift is referring to some kind of misanthropy. That means man-hating temperament. So do you consider that it is simply a nation or an institution or a class or a human being in general? Rather, you will find it is a particular form of criticism. It is a particular form of satire that is made against the human race in general. So that's why this particular discussion, this particular lecture is important for you. It is not simply because you have London. in your syllabus. Rather, you will encounter various kinds of satiric writings in your syllabus and also in the days ahead, that means in your future days or academic days. So that's why different kinds of satires are taken into consideration, and you will get there is a personal satire that is called lampoon. Okay, one fundamental or a very good example of lampoon is Macflecknoe by John Dryden. There is political satire, as you can find in Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel and other writings. It's a kind of a religious satire, as you can find the religion has been criticized in multiple other writings, the social satire, etc. So these are the patterns of satires according to their trains and according to their forms. Now, if I, on the basis of its patterning, you see, satire can be divided into two major sections or two major areas, you see. The first one, it is considered as the direct satire or formal satire. What is direct satire? Direct satire, you can identify what is direct satire. It is directly criticizing somebody. The satire is being made directly of something or somebody or maybe some class or maybe anything else. So in that fundamental basis, in that fundamental form, you will find that the direct or formal satire, here the satiric persona speaks. Satiric persona means the persona who is speaking actually, through whom the satire is being made. It is not possible for Samuel Johnson to write from his own perspective, that Samuel Johnson is going there. It is not possible. So that's why what happens, the satiric persona speaks out in the first person. That is fundamental thing, you see. First person will be treated. This I, you see, this I may address either the reader or else a character within the work itself. You see, that means in formal satire, again I repeat, in the formal satire, here the satiric persona speaks out in the first person. That means you can identify, it will be written in I, capital I, okay? And this I may address either the reader or else a character within the work itself, or either the reader, that means you probably who is reading this particular text, or maybe any particular character will be addressed by this man, the character who might be a particular character from the text, and who is called, it is very important, adversarius, you see. This is a term that have been associated with them. So it is who is called the adversarius, and whose major artistic function is to elicit and add credibility to the satiric speaker's comments. So what the speaker actually says, its credibility and elicitations have been made by this adversarius. So in this particular text, that is London by Samuel Johnson, you will find two persons being incorporated. One is the speaker who is stating in terms of I, and probably he is being treated as Samuel Johnson. And the second one is his friend who is Thales, okay, who is actually moving far from London, because London is no longer to be considered as a place where a person like Thales and Samuel Johnson can reside, can live any longer, because of its hypocrisy that is present within this particular country that is being stated here. Now, if we if you try to identify the particular ways through which the formal satire or direct satires can be divided, you will find somehow that the direct or formal satire can be divided into two major sections again, and these particular formations have been made according to the practizer. You will find the first term is called the Horatian satire. What is the Horatian satire? Probably from the name you can identify that Horatian satire is referring to the particular form of satire where Horace, you see, is the main person. That means Horace is writing them, right? So it is a particular pattern. Later on, the people are the neoclassicists are following them and writing in this particular form. But for the first time, you will find that that particular form of satire was being mastered by Horace, and it was found to be present in Horatian form of writing. What happens, in Horatian satire, we find the speaker manifests the character of an urban, witty, and tolerant man of the world. You see, the speaker is an urban personality, witty personality, tolerant personality, who is moved more often to wry amusement than to indignation at the spectacle of human folly, pretentiousness, and hypocrisy. So as I mentioned, that it is a form of direct or formal satire. So ultimately you will find the satire is also being aimed at the hypocrisy, pretentiousness, or human folly. But ultimately, you will find it is not the typical indignating perspective that the Horatian satire is being incorporating. Rather, it is a kind of an amusement. That means the tone of these kinds of satires are often considered to be amusing. That means it is light-hearted, right? So pretentiousness and okay, and who uses a relaxed and informal language to evoke from readers our wry smile as human failings and absurdities, sometimes including his own. So it's a form of satire, it's a form of criticism that is being made, but it is being lighthearted, and ultimately you will find somehow the satirists are aiming at the follies and pretentiousness and hypocrisy, but it is in a particular form of relaxed and informal use of languages. You see? So the smile is much more important here, and obviously the failings and absurdities come second. But the opposite kind of direct or formal satire that is very important for us regarding London, because it is an example of that particular form of satire, is the Juvenalian satire, for example. So ultimately, you will find that it is the particular thing that we should remember, we should keep it in mind, that ultimately we have to identify London as an example of Juvenalian satire. So you need to know about Juvenalian satire in detail. So what happens to be present here now, you will find that here the character of the speaker is that of a serious moralist. There lies the basic difference between Juvenalian satire and Horatian satire. You will find in case of Horatian satire, there is a light-hearted mind, a light-hearted manner has been incorporated. But now when you are thinking in terms of the Juvenalian satire, you will find a serious moralist is into action, you see. And the similar kind of thing is in London. Ultimately, you will find that the London is being spoken by from the perspective of Thales and Samuel Johnson, and you will find that the temperament of Samuel Johnson is so serious that you cannot find anything ludicrous there. But it is also satire, you see. That way we consider somehow that when there is satire, there must be some kind of ludicrosity and amusements, but it might not be possible in case of Juvenalian satire because the moralist is using the terms, you see. Right? So that's why here you will find that the speaker is that of a serious moralist who uses a dignified and public style of utterance to decry modes of vice and error which are no less dangerous because they are ridiculous, and who undertakes to evoke from readers contempt, moral indignation, or an unillusioned sadness at the aberration of humanity. So from these lines, probably you can identify what is the actual temperament of Juvenalian satire. It is much more serious. It is not ridiculous. Rather, the follies are considered to be dangerous, you see. The vices and errors have been taken in consideration. It will bring some contempt, okay, the mood of contempt. It will bring some moral indignation, and it will bring some unillusioned sadness at the aberration of humanity. So everywhere you will find that so far as Juvenalian satires are considered or concerned, you will find the basic temperament of these forms are seriousness. Serious and serious and serious. So ultimately, whenever you will go with the particular poem London, though it has to be considered as based on a particular form of satire by Juvenal, don't consider before reading this particular text that it will amuse you. Rather, it will preach you some kind of morality. Johnsonian canon of taste cannot follow the typical amusements and ludicrosity because he was a very serious person. He was a very serious man. I will come to Johnsonian canon of taste and Johnsonian pattern of writing and why Johnson always preferred this moralistic tone in his writing later in our later lectures. Now, this is the form of direct satire. So we have got the Horatian form of satire and Juvenalian form of satire. Now, this is another form that is indirect satire, you see, and it is cast in some other literary form than that of the direct address to the reader. That means in case of direct satire, you can find the direct address has been made, but in case of the indirect satire, it is not being done so. And the most common indirect form is that of a fictional narrative, obviously, you see, in which the objects of the satires are characters who make themselves and their opinions ridiculous by their words and actions. So it's a fictional narrative, you see, where the objects of satire are characters who make themselves and their opinions ridiculous. That means the persons are making themselves and their opinions ridiculous by help of or with the help of their words and with their actions, you see. So ultimately, under the particular group of indirect satire, you will get one particular form that is called Menippean satire or maybe Varronian satire. Why? Because according to the persons like Menippus and Varro, the names have been taken in consideration. So you will find that this Menippean satire or Varronian satire has been taken from, it is modeled on the Greek form developed by the Cynic philosopher Menippus, and it is sometimes called Varronian satire after a Roman imitator, that is Varro. Okay, and in this particular form of satire, as I mentioned earlier, so these satires are written in prose, usually with interpolations of verse. These are written in prose, and somehow you will find the interpolations of verse have been taken into consideration, and constitutes a miscellaneous form often held together by a loosely constructive narrative. So it is the fundamental structure of this particular satire. It is a series of extended dialogues and debates, you see, in which men from different professions and philosophical and intellectual ability come together and serve to make ludicrous the attitudes and viewpoints they typify by the arguments they urge in their supports. So ultimately, as we have already traced, we have identified that the indirect satire is actually aimed at, okay, a kind of, you see, that when the persons are actually criticizing themselves to some extent, because it is not directly being addressed to any other person or maybe class or maybe society. So that's why you will find that here the extended dialogues and debates are taken into consideration. The persons from different professions, philosophical and intellectual ability come together, and they serve to make ludicrous the attitudes and viewpoints they typify by the arguments they urge in their support. That means through their words, through their actions, through their discussions, through their confrontations, it have been taken into consideration that they are actually criticizing themselves. So this is a form of satire that is called Menippean satire and Varronian satire, and it does fall under the group of indirect satire. Now let us take the what happens, that when Juvenal wrote his satire, that is third satire, it was later translated into English by John Dryden, you see. So ultimately, why Samuel Johnson is to some extent following, he is imitating the third satire by Juvenal. That is the fundamental reason that in the third satire of Juvenal, you will find the particular story of Rome, or the presentation of Rome is being criticized, or to some extent Juvenal is criticizing Rome and Roman temperaments of the time regarding its hypocrisy, its fall, its degeneration, etc., etc. And all these things have been taken into consideration by Juvenal in his third satire, because there is the particular person like Ambricius, you see, who is the friend of Juvenal, and ultimately he's from the Ambricius's perspective, it is being conceptualized that Ambricius is leaving Rome and he is returning to Cumae. So ultimately, here also in London by Samuel Johnson, you will find that Johnson is also using the same temperament, the same pattern, where Johnson is from the perspective of Thales. Okay, I will come to that particular later, that who is Thales, probably with whom Thales can be compared and not, etc. Different kinds of critical contentions are actually being there regarding Johnson's friend. One particular friend was there, savage, and how so far Thales can be considered a savage or not. So ultimately, these are the patterns of discussions that will come to later. But here in this particular section, I have taken the first line, that is the title page. It has been written by Samuel Johnson. It's London, a poem in imitation of the third satire of Juvenal. So therefore, to give you the basic implication of what the third satire is about, I have taken the satires of Decimus Junius Juvenalis, and it was translated into English by Mr. John Dryden and several other eminent hands. So I have taken from that particular Dryden's translation of Juvenal's this third satire, and in that particular translation, at the very beginning, this particular section was written. That is, to some extent, in a nutshell, Dryden is incorporating what he is aiming at. What he says, therefore, here it is written, the story actually. The story of this satire speaks itself. It's Dryden's writing, obviously. Ambricius, the supposed friend of Juvenal, and himself a poet, is leaving Rome. So you can find the similarity between the particular situation. Here in London by Samuel Johnson, Thales is leaving London. And now it is in the third satire of Juvenal, Ambricius is leaving Rome and retiring to Cumae or Camille. Our author, that is Juvenal, accompanies him out of town. Before they take leave of each, Ambricius tells his friend the reasons which oblige him to lead a private life in an obscure place. That is why Ambricius chooses to leave London and live in an obscure place. He complains that an honest man cannot get his bread at Rome. That is, it is the dishonesty, typical form of dishonesty and degeneration that is prevailing throughout Rome. So it is not possible for an honest man to get his bread easily at Rome. So that is the actual situation of London that will be portrayed in London by Samuel Johnson. That none but flatterers, you see, make their fortunes there. That Grecians and other foreigners raise themselves by those sordid arts, that is, flattery, which describes, and against which he bitterly inveighs. So ultimately, he doesn't approve these kinds of life leading. He reckons up the several inconveniences which arise from a city life and the many dangers which attend it, upbraids the nobleman with covetousness, that is covetousness, for not rewarding good poets, and arraigns the government for starving them. So that is the particular fundamental reason why he is supposed to leave the particular city. The great art of this satire is particularly shown in commonplaces and drawing in as many vices as could naturally fall into the compass of it. So it is the introductory perspective that is being made by, or that has been done by John Dryden regarding the particular text of the satire of Juvenal, that is the third satire of Juvenal. Now you can identify probably what are the basic similarities, why London, or in that particular title page, Samuel Johnson is using the particular term imitation of the third satire of Juvenal, because you can find the similarities, you can find the patterns of writing. It will be helpful to you if you go through the third satire of Juvenal, or maybe you read the text, or maybe the summary of the third satire of Juvenal. Then you can identify the similarities between the particular poem by Juvenal and the particular poem by Johnson, that is London. So up to this, so ultimately in our next lecture, we will go with the political scenarios of behind London, behind the creation of London, and we will do with some a little biographical part of Samuel Johnson, and then only, that is probably we will need another particular lecture for the introductory purpose, and then only we can move towards the text of London line by line. Obviously, it will be very helpful to you, I think. So go through the text, go through this particular lecture, and go through the introductory perspectives that have been found on your internet. So today up to this, thank you then.